Good morning. I want to welcome you to the Saltzman Forum, which is made possible by the generosity of Arnold Saltzman. This forum brings expertise of analysts to bear on important issues of public policy, and the experts you'll hear from today are observers from within Columbia and from outside, from other institutions, and I think you will see from the biographical information in the brochures how relevant their perspectives are. I think Afghanistan, or AFPAC, as the Beltway jargon for the combined problem of Afghanistan and Pakistan is now described, is the top priority problem in foreign policy facing the new administration, and one that not too many genuinely informed observers are absolutely confident can be solved by any particular formula. You've all heard the cliche that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. Of course, the current challenge now is to invalidate that cliche. And it may be an even bigger challenge than most other cases of political instability and unconventional warfare, problems that are always difficult for intervening powers to address effectively. And the entanglement of the campaign against the Taliban and al-Qaeda with disorder in Pakistan compounds the difficulty and raises the novel risk of a country with nuclear weapons collapsing into chaos. So we have two panels today to put these issues into context and outline what solutions may or may not apply, and to reflect on the odds for success of the U.S. and NATO attempt to keep the region from spinning into deeper disaster. Our first panel will look at the big picture of where Afghanistan fits into the region and foreign policy issues on a wider level. And then the second panel will delve more into specific consideration of strategy and tactics. We hope by the time the second panel starts that it will be complete, although we've just found out that one of the panelists, Lieutenant Colonel Ike Wilson, had a car accident on the way. Being a resourceful Army officer, we trust that he will find a way to get here, but if not, we'll have all the more time to hear from Steve Biddle and Max Boot. Tanisha, take it away.
Thank you. Well, we're extremely fortunate to have this very distinguished panel to start us off today for the Saltzman Forum. The topic of the panel is Afghanistan in regional and global perspective, and I'm just going to briefly introduce the panelists. To my left is Steve Cole, President and CEO of the New America Foundation. You may know him from his writings in the New Yorker as well. And then we have Shumik Ganguly, who is an expert in South Asian regional foreign policy. And he's a professor of political science at Indiana University. And then finally, we have our own Kim Marten, who's a professor of political science and chair of the political science department at Barnard College. Professor Marten is an expert on peacekeeping, has done intensive field research on Afghanistan, is currently doing some work on warlordism and ungoverned territories, and she's going to start the panel off today.
Thank you, Dick and Nisha. Is this on? Can you hear this? Okay. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and what I am going to start off talking about is a relatively small geographical area, but one that is absolutely crucial for everything else that we are going to be talking about today. There we go. Pakistani's tribal areas, the federally administered tribal areas. And I think it's really important that we talk about this in some depth because I think some of the surface level discussion about what's happening in the tribal areas has not always correctly identified what the politics and the political situation actually is in that region. So why are the federally administered tribal areas so crucial? Basically three reasons. First of all, they are currently an al-Qaeda safe haven in the views of many policymakers. In particular, there's very good evidence that al-Qaeda militants crossed the border into the tribal areas immediately after the Battle of Tora Bora, and that's where a lot of the operations are being run from. It's certainly a staging ground for Taliban militant activities that are happening in Afghanistan. We hear about that a lot, about the militants crossing the border. And it's also a staging ground for radical Islamists elsewhere in Pakistan, which has obviously been in the news a great deal the last few weeks. This map here gives you a sense of where Fatah fits into some of the other things that we'll be talking about today. You can see that it's right along the border with Afghanistan. The dark area is Fatah. The paler gray area is the Northwest Frontier Province, which is one of the governed provinces of Pakistan. But in recent weeks and months, it's one of the areas where the very militant Islamists have been taking over districts bit by bit. So ones that you can see on the map that have been in the news are Swat, Malakand, and then just this morning we heard about Bunair. And what this means, I don't know if this is large enough for you to be able to see, but you can see where Swat is. It's the long, thin one that comes down from the northern areas. And what it means with these three areas being ones where the militants have essentially taken over the government is that the capital city of the Northwest Frontier Province is now almost surrounded by militant activities. And if that capital city is not held, that is probably the direction where you would have a lot of militant Islamist activity moving into the rest of Pakistan. So this area is absolutely crucial for all of the discussion that's happening. You may have heard that yesterday Hillary Clinton testified before Congress saying that she's very concerned that Pakistan isn't doing enough to try to maintain its sovereignty and that is essentially giving up in the face of this militant activity. What are some key background facts about the federally administered tribal areas? Well, it's a very mountainous, rocky land, and the reason that's significant is that it means that things like large-scale agriculture are not going to be profitable there. It's an area that does not have a lot of clear sources or drivers for economic activity. It's an impoverished area with a largely illiterate population. The literacy rates vary across the various districts of the Fatah, but they basically range from about 2% in some districts to about 20% literacy in other districts. And so it's an area where there's a largely uneducated population. Literacy rates among women are obviously going to be even lower than those overall literacy rates. In addition to that, the Fatah is an area that has semi-permanent Afghan refugees. And the reason that I put Afghan in quotation marks is that many of these people are the younger generation of people who fled in the original Afghan war, starting in the late 1970s and then into the 1980s. And there are, the experts' best guess is that there are several 100,000 people who are living in Fatah, in the region to the south, in Baluchistan, and also in the Northwest Frontier Province, who consider themselves to be Afghan citizens, but who may have little experience of Afghanistan or of living in Afghanistan. And this population also doesn't really recognize the border as being particularly significant. And so there's lots of transition back and forth across the border. So, for example, people might go back to home areas in Afghanistan when the harvest comes up to help with the agricultural things that are happening in Afghanistan, or they might flee back and forth over the border depending on what's happening with the security situation at present. And the Pashtun ethnic group straddles the border. Now, why does that end up being significant? It ends up being significant because from the founding of Pakistan in 1947, the government of Pakistan has been very concerned about the possibility that Pakistan would not actually hold together as a state. And also from the founding of Pakistan in 1947, the government of Afghanistan has never actually recognized the Durand Line. The Durand Line is the artificial border that separates Afghanistan from Pakistan. It was put into place by the British Empire, and from the beginning, the Afghanistan government has never recognized that line as actually being a border. What that has meant is that from the beginning of Pakistan's founding, and certainly at some key points in Pakistan's history, Pakistan has been very afraid that whoever is in charge in Afghanistan will try to break off this area that is called Pashtunistan from the rest of Pakistani territory. And on the right-hand side there, you see a photograph of the quote-unquote flag of Pashtunistan, and that flag actually tended to appear on Afghanistan government brochures and posters and so forth at various times in the history between the two states. This became a particular issue in 1971 when Bangladesh broke off from Pakistan, that had been East Pakistan, broke off from the rest of the country. The government at that point was very concerned that maybe Pashtunistan would follow Bangladesh, and so there was a real effort to reach out to the Pashtun population. It was a concern during the time of the Soviet intervention. There was fear that the Soviets would try to rile up nationalist sentiment in Pashtunistan to try to grow the country of Afghanistan. And it's an issue that you will still hear Pakistani government officials talking about today because some of the secular political parties in the Northwest Frontier Province are people who talk about Pashtunistan in their political literature as well. So obviously very complex geographically, in terms of where the border lies and what the political significance of that is. Well, oftentimes you'll hear that the tribal areas are ungovernable. So I think it's worth raising the question, are the tribal areas today ungoverned? Well, according to the Pakistani Constitution, the state of Pakistan in the tribal areas is represented by political agents. Those political agents report directly to Pakistan's president, and the governor of the Northwest Frontier Province is, in practice, the intermediary who deals with all of those questions. And that right there should sort of give us pause if we're talking about the possibility that the Northwest Frontier Province capital is now surrounded by militants. That's an indication of getting rid of that capital would be a way of further decreasing the ability of the Pakistani government to have any influence whatsoever in the tribal areas, because that is sort of an intermediary political position. So to this day, what is in place in terms of the legal base for the tribal areas are a set of rules that were put in place by the British Empire called the Frontier Crimes Resolution, and what the regulation, and what the FCR means are that the population of the tribal areas doesn't have individual legal rights to the extent that other individual actors in Pakistan do. Now, we can argue about whether the Pakistan legal system provides rights for anybody at the moment, but keep in mind that the population of the tribal areas has even fewer legal rights than the rest of the population of Pakistan because they cannot appeal any decisions that are made to the Pakistani court system if they feel that they are being unfairly prosecuted for something that they've done. And in particular, it is still in place that the political agents can carry out collective rewards and punishments against various tribes and sub-tribes. And so this has been done in the War on Terror. You'll see that a person who's a member of a sub-tribe, sometimes even a person living in the supposedly settled areas of Pakistan, will be punished, put in jail for a militant action that's taken by another member of their sub-tribe on the territorial, the tribal areas as a form of punishment. And Christine Fair at the RAND Corporation has talked a great deal about this, and so I'd really recommend a lot of her writings on that subject to you. On the territory itself, members of parliament are elected to the National Assembly in Pakistan, but it's not really clear what they do because Pakistani law doesn't apply to the tribal areas. And so, yes, there is political representation at the center, but it doesn't particularly mean anything for the people who live in the tribal areas. Now, in theory, Pashtun tribal law, or Pakhtunwali, is supposed to be what is put into place in those areas. So according to Pakhtunwali, all Pashtun men are created equal, and therefore all of them have an equal voice in politics, and it should be a democratic system. And the democratic councils, or the jirgas, are the ones who choose the political representatives that come out of the tribal areas, the Maliks, and they are the ones who make policy in cooperation with the political agents. And so that is a lot of what you hear, that the Pashtuns have this very equality-based system, and they have an alternative governance system, and that shouldn't be interfered with. Well, in practice, since the times of the British Empire, there have been appointed official Maliks. The British did this because they wanted to have people who were people that they felt they could work with, who were people who had a certain degree of power in the tribal areas. And so as a result, they selected certain Maliks that they chose to work with. And these Maliks got subventions from the British Empire. They would be paid, the tribes as a whole would be paid by the British Empire, and then the official Maliks would get another 7% subvention on top of what went to the tribes as a whole. And not surprisingly, that meant that the Maliks actually had a lot of artificial power that meant that they weren't really equal to all other Pashtun men anymore. Well, these were retained by the Pakistani state in 1947. And if you remember back to the map that I put up, the areas that are Pashtun dominant go right over into the border with India. One of the reasons that the Pakistani state decided to keep this system is that the Pashtun official Maliks were some of the big participants in the original war over Kashmir during the partition era with India. And so the Pakistani state wished to reward them and wished to also ensure that Pashtunistan did not break off from the rest of the country. So to get Pashtunistan to remain part of Pakistan and to reward the Maliks for participation in the Kashmir activities, they were continued to receive these subventions. And official Malik status is now hereditary. And so what that means is that these families of the official Maliks are the ones who continue to be favored by the Pakistani state. And that means, for example, that they get construction contracts from the Pakistani state. So whenever the Pakistani state decides that it's going to build schools, or it's going to build a healthcare complex, or it's going to put a road through the tribal areas, it's these official Maliks who are the ones whose families get the construction contracts and who essentially have control over what the Pakistani state decides to do. In addition to that, because they are the people who work with the Pakistani state, they control everything else that the Pakistani state controls for residents of the tribal areas. That includes visas for foreign travel, and that becomes really important when we're talking about a population that has tended to engage in migrant labor. They've tended to go, for example, to the Persian Gulf to work on various construction projects. They've tended to go elsewhere, and it's the Maliks, the official Maliks, who control who gets the visa, the official visa to go abroad. When there are disasters or when there is a famine of some kind happening in the areas, it is the Maliks who control how the aid is distributed. The Maliks control who gets the official state-sponsored scholarships that allow people to get out of the Fatah and go to the university, for example, in Peshawar. So the Maliks, the official Maliks, are very powerful people who have maintained this relationship with the Pakistani state, and that means that thinking about these territories as ungoverned or ungovernable isn't really quite accurate. What has that meant for the official Maliks in recent times? Well, it turns out that much of the population of the tribal areas probably believes that many of these official Maliks are corrupt. And we have seen statements about that since the 1970s, but certainly it's something that is growing stronger in recent times. And this is something that some Pakistani-based research institutions have collected a lot of information about, that in fact these official Maliks are not necessarily seen as the best political representation of the population that lives in the Fatah. Resentment against these official Maliks is believed to contribute to some of the levels of Taliban support. The Taliban is seen as an alternative to these people who work with the Pakistani state and who tend to favor their own subclans or their own families in relationship to others. And in particular, some people feel that because it is primogeniture that determines who the official Maliks are, it's hereditary, but it's hereditary with the oldest son of each family assuming the title when the previous person stops being the official Malik. It means that the junior members of the families are some of the people who are resentful because they're not always cutting to the deals that the senior members of the families are. Now, in addition to this, hundreds of Maliks have been murdered in recent times. We've heard about this in the press. And these are the ones who have done the most to cooperate with the Pakistani state in the war on terror to the extent that that has happened in recent years. And so the Taliban has been actively targeting, or other Pakistani militants have been individually targeting the Maliks who have been working most closely with the United States and with the elements in the Pakistani government that are cooperating with the United States. What about radical Islamism in the Fatah? Keep in mind that it doesn't have any historical base. Pashtunwali, the tribal code, was something that always superseded Islamism. The tribal code certainly integrated Islam into its precepts, but the tribal code had precedence over Islamism. And in particular, up until very recently, the mullahs needed Malik protection. The mullahs didn't have their own security forces for the most part, and so they needed the political leaders, the Maliks, in order to ensure that they would, for example, have their mosques and their madaris or madrasas kept safe from raiders who might come through. And what that meant is that the mullahs and the Maliks worked in cooperation with each other. What has happened over the last several decades, however, is that radical Islamists in the Fatah have been funded by outsiders. So originally, during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, when you had Mujahideen fighters against the Soviets, that funding came from the Pakistani state, from Saudi Arabia, and from the United States. And keep in mind that that was not just directed against the Soviet occupiers, it was also directed against Iran. Because one of the issues that still is present in the Fatah and surrounding areas today is the Sunni Shiite competition. And there was real fear in the late 1970s that Iran might try to rile up Shiites in this area of Pakistan to try to get inroads against the Pakistani state. Then, when the Taliban emerged in more recent times, for a while the Pakistani state was also giving explicit help to the Taliban because they were seen as a group that could provide safe transit for the trade that was going back and forth across the border between the two. What about radical Islamism in the Fatah today? Well, it's still funded by outside sources. Al-Qaeda is one of the major outside funders of radical Islamism. Al-Qaeda pays rent and pays protection money to those who are willing to give funding to it or willing to give support to it. Some of the funds for radical madaris or madrasas in the area have come from the Arab world, private actors, and from Pakistani immigrants, especially Pakistani immigrants living in the United Kingdom. And there's also a transnational narcotics trade that we know that the radical Islamists are benefiting from. So that means that we should be really careful when we talk about support for the Taliban and support for radical Islam in the Fatah areas. But keep in mind that there is some real local support, and that's something that we don't always hear about on a surface level in the United States, because the radical groups appeal to those who are not favored by the official Maliks. Because the militias and the madrasas, the madaris, the educational locations that come out of radical Islam provide jobs for people in these impoverished areas who are basically functionally illiterate and who couldn't work in any other situation at the moment. And also, Taliban law is seen as an alternative to the absent Pakistani state. There's a great sense in these areas that the Pakistani state just doesn't care about them. They don't have any rights under Pakistani law. And the Taliban, you may not agree with all of their rules, but at least they give swift justice, and they have some sort of predictable system in place that isn't based on the corruption of the official Maliks. So it's a very complicated situation. Obama has talked a lot about the Fatah recently, saying we must isolate al-Qaeda from the Pakistani people, and he says that he supports a congressional bill that would create opportunity zones in the border regions to develop the economy and bring hope. I would just point out that there's some dilemmas involved in this. Who's going to manage these economic opportunity zones if they, in fact, are created? There's this issue of corruption. If it's done in cooperation with the Pakistani state has an obligation to make these arrangements with the official Maliks. There's also the security question. If these economic opportunity zones threaten the Taliban and other radical Islamist militants, then they're going to be the primary sites where attacks are going to take place, and so somebody has to provide support for them. Now, some other people have suggested constitutional change to make Fatah a normal province, that would be a solution. Just keep in mind that the official Maliks have a constitutional veto. The constitution was passed in Pakistan with the official Malik support, and they would be probably very upset about having their power taken away from them and turning the Fatah into an official province. And it also would threaten the key assets of radical Islamists, which is having an alternative to the Pakistani government, and so they would also probably be very unhappy about that. So I only have 1 minute left, but just let me present a radical suggestion, and I'd be happy to take comments about this during our discussion session, which is that what we might think about doing is, if we really want to separate the militants from the Pashtun population, is encourage economic migration out of Fatah, because Fatah doesn't really have a lot of drivers for economic growth, which leads to the question of where exactly would economic zones be set up that would attract migrants. But just keep in mind that the Pashtun population has a very long, storied history of migration on behalf of economic profit, especially during the Persian Gulf oil boom, and that the majority of Pashtuns don't live in Fatah. They live in the Northwest Frontier Province and large Pakistani cities. So there's no particular reason why, from a cultural perspective, the Pashtun population has to remain in Fatah. So just something to consider, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.